Hello everyone. Today we're going to be discussing capitalism, individualism, and reform, the next section in our textbook. So clearly, between our last readings and documentary viewing and the readings for today, an entire civil war occurred in America from 1861 to 1865. So the South's unconditional surrender on April 9, 1865 at the Appomattox Courthouse, which also gave way to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, brought an uneasy peace between the states. However, very little actually changed within the federal government itself. For instance, black people were no longer slaves, but the slave laws were replaced by new Jim Crow laws, which ushered in an American-style apartheid that would soon be institutionalized and wreak havoc on racial relations for much of the 19th and 20th centuries. So during this time period, we can parse out that four major revolutions occurred within America itself. The first one is that agriculture was transformed from subsistence farming to cash crop farming. That is, people used to farm basically to live, and now they were making money off of the various products that they did indeed grow. Farmers were thus exposed to markets, a business cycle, monopolies, and of course politics. The second revolution is that surplus subsistence farmers, plus millions of new European immigrants, were turned into a highly productive and regimented working class. Thus, again, the birth of the working class in America. Workers began to attempt to unionize, and they were often faced with violence while doing so, in order to cope with the changing market. The third revolution that we can see going on is the mechanization of industry's importance, which cannot be overstated. Railroads, electric wires, and conveyor belts streamlined industry and made further Western expansion possible. The final revolution that we begin to see is the revolutionary advancement of capitalism, which brought the other three revolutions together in the greatest economic boom in world history. So, what is capitalism? This term is first coined by Karl Marx in his 1848 Communist Manifesto. Capitalism was a new kind of economy. It grew right along with its adversaries, and thus it was constantly on the defensive. Economic expansion, coupled with the regimentation of labor and the vast inequality in the distribution of income, spawned hosts of critics of capitalism. So let's start with our first author, Andrew Carnegie. So this one is called Wealth, or more often, The Gospel of Wealth, was published in 1889. So Wealth, or The Gospel of Wealth, is an article written by Carnegie in 1889 that describes the responsibility of philanthropy by the new upper class of self-made rich. Carnegie proposed that the best way of dealing with the new phenomenon of wealth inequality was for the wealthy to redistribute their surplus means in a responsible and thoughtful manner. This approach was contrasted with traditional bequest, which means patrimony, where wealth is handed down to heirs, and other forms of bequest, where wealth is willed to the state for public purposes. Carnegie argued that surplus wealth is put to best use, i.e. produces the greatest net benefit to society, when it is administered carefully by the wealthy. Carnegie also argues against wasteful use of capital in the form of extravagance, irresponsible spending, or self-indulgence. He instead promoted the administration of said capital over the course of one's lifetime toward the cause of reducing the stratification between the rich and poor. As a result, the wealthy should administer their riches responsibly and not in a way that encourages what he calls the slothful, the drunken, and the unworthy. The Gospel of Wealth asserts that hard work and perseverance lead to wealth, implying that poverty is a character flaw. Carnegie based his philosophy on the observation that the heirs of large fortunes frequently squandered them in riotous living rather than nurturing and growing them. Even bequeathing one's fortune to charity was no guarantee that it would be used wisely, due to the fact that there was no guarantee that a charitable organization not under one's direction would use the money in accordance with one's wishes. Carnegie disapproved of charitable giving that maintained the poor in their impoverished state, and urged a movement towards the creation of a new mode of giving that would create opportunities for the beneficiaries of the gift to better themselves. As a result, the gift would not be simply consumed, but would be productive of even greater wealth through the house. In Wealth, Carnegie examines the modes of distributing accumulated wealth and capital to the communities from which they originate. He preached that ostentatious living and amassing private treasures were wrong. He praised the high British taxes on the estates of dead millionaires, remarking that by taxing estates heavily at death, the state marks its condemnation of the selfish millionaire's unworthy life. It is desirable that nations should go much further in this direction. Carnegie made it clear that the rich were best suited for the recirculation of their money back into society, where it could be used to support the greater good, given that they are presumed to have a penchant for management of capital. However, he shunned aristocratic chains of inheritance and argued that dependents should be supported by their work with major moderation, with the bulk of excess wealth to be spent on enriching the community. In cases where excess wealth was held until death, he advocated its apprehension by the state on a progressive scale. He says, "Indeed, it is difficult to set bounds to share of a rich man's estates which should go at his death to the public through the agency of the state, and by all means such taxes should be granted, beginning at nothing upon moderate sums to dependents, and increasing rapidly as the amounts swell, until of the millionaire's hoard, at least the other half comes to the privy coffer of the state." He claimed that, in bettering society and people here on earth, one would be rewarded at the gates of paradise. Now, Carnegie practiced what he preached. He put his philosophy into practice through a program of gifts to endow public libraries, known as Carnegie Libraries, in cities and towns throughout the United States and the English-speaking world, with the idea that he was thus providing people with the tools to better themselves. The Detroit Public Library, for example, is a Carnegie library. In order to ensure that his gifts would not be wasted, he stipulated that the municipality must pass an ordinance establishing a tax to support the library's ongoing operating costs, after the initial grant provided the costs for building and equipping the library. After several communities squandered their grants on extravagant buildings, Carnegie established a system of architectural guidelines that mandated simplicity and functionality. When it became obvious that Carnegie could not give away his entire fortune within his lifetime, he established the Carnegie Foundation to continue his program of giving. Next up is Henry Damaris Lloyd, and here we have his article, Wealth Against Commonwealth. So Lloyd was referred to as a muckraker, a term used in the Progressive era to characterize reform-minded American journalists who wrote largely for all popular magazines. They relied on their own investigative journalism reporting. Muckrakers often worked to expose social ills and corporate and political corruption. Lloyd was on the editorial staff of the Chicago Tribune from 1872 to 1885, but resigned to study social problems. His Wealth Against Commonwealth is an attack on monopolies, based especially on an analysis of Standard Oil Company. He traveled widely, writing about conditions in various countries, and always supported the causes of the underprivileged. So as I said, he's part of this progressive movement that begins to take shape in the late 19th century. And this is a broadly based reform movement that reached its height in the early 20th century, and is generally considered to be a middle class and reformist in nature. It arose as a response to the vast changes brought by modernization, such as the growth of large corporations and railroads, and fears of corruption in American politics. In the 21st century, progressives continue to embrace concepts such as environmentalism and social justice. Social progressivism, the view that governmental practices ought to be adjusted as society evolves, forms the ideological basis for many American progressives. William Jennings Bryan's Cross of Gold speech was delivered at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago on July 9, 1896. In the address, Bryan supported bimetallism, or free silver, which he believed would bring the nation prosperity. He decried the gold standard, concluding the speech, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." Bryan's address helped catapult him to the Democratic Party's presidential nomination. It is considered one of the greatest political speeches in American history. So for 20 years, Americans had been bitterly divided over the nation's monetary standard. The gold standard, which the United States had effectively been on since 1873, limited the money supply but eased trade with other nations, such as the United Kingdom, whose currency was also based on gold. Many Americans, however, believed that bimetallism, that is, making both gold and silver legal tender, was necessary for the nation's economic health. The financial panic of 1893 intensified the debates, and when the Democratic President Grover Cleveland continued to support the gold standard against the will of much of his party, activists became determined to take over the Democratic Party organization and nominate a silver-supporting candidate in 1896. Bryan had been a dark horse candidate with little support in the convention. His speech, delivered at the close of the debate on the party platform, electrified the convention and is generally credited with giving him the nomination for president. However, he lost the general election to William McKinley, and the United States formally adopted the gold standard in 1900. So, for today, I would like you to consider these questions using examples from the text to support your responses in lieu of us meeting in class. This will count as your attendance and participation. You may either email your responses to me before the beginning of class on Wednesday, or you may print them out and bring them in. I'll accept either. So the first question has to do with Carnegie. Carnegie believed that a separation of classes was productive and even essential in maintaining a healthy society. Do you agree with him? The second one is, Lloyd's Wealth Against Commonwealth is charged with emotion. Does this reliance on pathos distract from his message? Why or why not? And why does Bryan use the image of a gold cross/crucifixion when railing against the gold standard? Again, you can send your answers to me by email or bring them to class with you on Wednesday. Have a great day, and I will see you then. Bye!